From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. On today's program, we'll be talking about the French presidential election and its implications for the Middle East. In the second round of France's two-round presidential vote, held on April 24th, incumbent Emmanuel Macron of the centrist party La République En Marche defeated Marine Le Pen of the hard-right National Rally by 58.5% to 41.5%. It's made him the first sitting French president to be re-elected in 20 years, although his margin of victory was substantially smaller than in their previous matchup in 2017. You can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. To discuss the results of the election and what they mean for French foreign policy and the Middle East, I'm joined today by three great guests: Intissar Fakir, Cinzia Bianco, and Perla Srour-Gandon. Intissar is a senior fellow and the director of MEI's North Africa and the Sahel program. Cinzia is a research fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and a non-resident scholar with MEI's Defense and Security program. Perla is a policy advisor for the Secretariat of the Committee on Foreign Affairs at the European Parliament. I should also note that the information and views set out in this podcast are those of the speaker and do not necessarily reflect the official opinion of the European Union. Intissar, Cinzia, Perla, welcome to the podcast, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us, Alistair.
Thank you for having us.
Cinzia, let's start with you. To give our listeners a little bit of context, can you kind of set the scene? What was at stake in this election, and what were the expectations in the run-up to the second round on April 24th?
Right. This was a very important election, and it was relevant not only for France, but also in the rest of Europe, in particular the countries of the European Union, because, President Emmanuel Macron has been sort of different from other presidents before, in that he has initiated a few projects at the level of the European Union, not only at the level of France, especially in foreign policy, but also, on issues of economic sovereignty or digital policies and so on. So a non-re-election would have meant sort of stopping some of these projects halfway and turning backwards on so many of them, given that his direct opponent, Marine Le Pen from Front National, is actually one of the leading Eurosceptic populist far-right candidates in Europe. So that would have really meant an abrupt turn around on so many different levels for France, but also in the wider European context, and a lot of them on foreign and security policies. Specifically, Macron has been pushing for further integration on these two fronts, and certainly Le Pen would have been willing to stop all of those integration processes.
Intissar, I'm curious to get your thoughts on the view from the region. How was the race perceived in North Africa, particularly given that immigration and the role of Islam in French society were both significant issues in the campaign?
There was a major concern, I would say, among most people I spoke to about the impact of Le Pen's rising popularity and the headway that she and her party managed to make over the past 5 years alone. Now, prior to the first round, there was also a real fear of Eric Zemmour and his, frankly, despicable comments on minorities, particularly Muslims, on migrants, that by contrast made Marine Le Pen seem quite tame. I would say that for most people in North Africa, particularly the Maghreb, the French elections are a practical issue. It's not just something sort of happening in a foreign country. It is rare to find a family that does not have a member, close or far, that lives in France and whose lives are directly impacted by this election. But there's also a sense that I have heard talking to people. I was in Morocco a couple of weeks ago when Marine Le Pen's numbers were looking quite good and Macron hadn't quite pushed full steam with his campaign. There was both a real fear that she could be elected, but also a sense of dissatisfaction with Macron himself for his toughening stand on migration and migration policies over the past couple of weeks, and for some of the controversial speeches and comments that he has made, his crusade against these imaginary Islamist separatist threats, and really the way that his government has used that to target community centers and places of worship that affect the Muslim community. So for a lot of people that I spoke to, they would say, yes, of course, she's dangerous, but in many regards, they're kind of the same. I would say that's in terms of popular perception. In terms of governments, there was also a bit of concern about what Marine Le Pen's France first policy would mean. These governments have close ties with France. These are former colonies, of course. There is also substantial cooperation between France and North Africa and Maghreb countries, particularly on security issues, on migration. Of course, there's a lot of people-to-people ties that we've talked about. France is also heavily involved in Sahel security. But, my sense is that there was a concern that if elected, there might be a change in the level of support that Marine Le Pen government would provide to North African partners, maybe a change in the level of engagement. But I think also, having said all of that, I would add that, for North African governments, they know that they will always have to have a relationship with France. But the concern here would be what kind of change and how substantial it would be. But I think the regimes understand that in North Africa, whether it's Macron, whether it's Le Pen, France will always prioritize security in the region. And France strongly believes that security is best served by these sort of more autocratic regimes, and they will continue to support them in one way or another.
Perla, how important was foreign policy in this election, and how much of an impact do you think it had on the result?
Well, I would say that the importance of foreign policy in the election, if you look at the program of the 12 candidates, depending of some of them had more foreign policy, obviously President Macron, than the others. But 24 February marked a turning point. And the war in Ukraine has imposed itself, to have a debate on international challenges. And you see at the end of March, 25th March, all the candidates have included their position and differing one from the other on Ukraine and toward Russia or towards NATO. This has been even more materialized for the second round and during the debate, that has opposed President Macron and candidate Marine Le Pen. And the debate on Russia and on the war in Ukraine and of Mrs. Marine Le Pen being accused of being pro-Russian was really, really present during the last stretch of the election. So there was an important impact, I would say. But maybe if I may just to take 1 minute to give you the general picture from the EU perspective, the French election took place during what we call the French presidency of the Council. So as you know, and as the audience might know, the EU is governed by the Council, which represents the 27 member states, the Commission is the executive, and the European Parliament represents the legislative part of the Union. And when it comes to the Council, you have a rotating presidency, and each member state had a rotating presidency, and France has taken its 6 months presidency since the 1st January 2022, which means it's a double challenge for President Macron, because he had at the same time to organize the French presidency of the Council at the EU level, combined with a national presidential election. And I can say today it's a success because the program and the priorities under the French presidency of the Council were achieved in a way, and mainly on the international scene, on Indo-Pacific, on the Sahel that maybe we will develop later in the discussion, and on the Middle East with specific priorities on JCPOA and other ones. And the second success, obviously, is the fact that he managed to be re-elected on 24th of April.
Cinzia, turning to the results themselves, what implications do you think they will have on French policy towards the Middle East?
I think it's fair to say that Macron has always had a very ambitious program vis-a-vis the Middle East and North Africa, and in the wider sense. And also that he has sort of given the region a lot of priority, unlike many other presidents and leaders of different European governments. I think that with, this new term, which is going to be the last for Macron, he cannot run again. He will sort of double down on this prioritization of the wider Middle East and North Africa and sort of continue some of the different initiatives that he has opened. For example, when in the Gulf in 2017, Saudi Arabia and the UAE closed their borders with Qatar and initiated 3 years long political boycott and economic embargo on Qatar. Macron was extremely active in trying to solve the situation diplomatically and was the only actually leader at the time to be in touch with all of the different sides in the region, including Turkey, Iran, Qatar itself, Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And then, of course, he has his initiative on Lebanon, which has encountered many, many difficulties, but I don't think he's ready to give it up at all. And then, of course, as Intissar was also saying, clearly trying to reboot some of the relations with the North African countries and really trying to, in a way, re-energize some of these relations. And then the clear importance that Macron has attributed to the Gulf. I think we can say that in Europe, he is one of the very few leaders who has rather quickly and clearly identified the shifting political balance and power balance in the wider Middle East and North Africa, and the emergence of the Gulf monarchies as actors of change, really able to turn a page and affect change from a geopolitical, economic, energy, and security even point of view in the wider region. So I think, we will see all of these different trends sort of continue, but really a wish to double down. And of course, all of that will be filtered through the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the new priorities that event has set for everyone.
Intissar, Cinzia touched on it briefly, but I want to drill down on North Africa and the Sahel in a bit more detail. What are your expectations for French foreign policy in the region?
Yeah, I agree with Cinzia. I think this will continue to be an important region and an important relationship for Macron. And I think we'll continue to see sort of that same kind of approach over the next 5 years. With Morocco specifically, Macron has been able to repair French ties, which had been, damaged under President Hollande. Morocco once again here values stability, and the monarchy does provide that in Morocco. Strong intelligence cooperation and security cooperation continues with Morocco and even Algeria. And I think we're likely to see that continue. With Tunisia, Macron also has good ties with Kais Saied. I would say that, France is one of the few countries that maintains that strong relationship. Macron and France have been unwilling to push Kais Saied on the democratic backslide that he's been orchestrating. And I think that's likely to continue, really, unless President Kais Saied's action become quite destabilizing, meaning that they generate substantial unrest on the street. So that's as far as Tunisia goes. So we'll continue, I imagine, to see strong collaboration between the two, Morocco and Algeria. There's been some tension, of course, over France cutting back on the number of visas that they provide for people to visit families and incoming migrants and such. And this was an example of Macron moving right on migration issues following some of the violence in France, particularly the beheading of the French teacher that happened in 2020. Again, this created some tension, but I think a lot of these governments sort of understand that this was a domestically motivated political move. With Algeria, France's relationship is fraught and has always been fraught with tension. France has a really ugly colonial legacy in all of these places, but a particularly bloody and repressive one in Algeria. And here I would say, Macron has arguably done more than any of his predecessors to address this legacy. He commissioned a report to look at France's colonial history in Algeria, the abuse that was perpetrated by French military and French police. But France has yet to apologize to these populations for the violence or even put in place any kind of restitution. But, Macron understands that that's important for the long-term future of these relations. He has talked about putting in place, I think it's called the Memories and Truth Commission to move forward. So hopefully that will materialize and help address some of this tension. On the Sahel, again here, France's withdrawal from Mali will continue, but I think France will maintain a presence and a supportive role, in the Sahel, particularly in places like Chad and in Niger, potentially moving more of its operations or strengthening existing ones further west, in keeping with where the terrorist threats have been spreading recently. I think we're likely to see France continue to support and strengthen multilateral initiatives and also prioritize multilateral engagement with Sahel countries and with multilateral initiatives such as the G5 Sahel and the Accra initiative. Hopefully, also supporting a more integrated approach to terrorism and extremism instead of a heavily securitized approach. I think overall, the Sahel will continue to be an important issue for France and for the EU, especially as Russian forces are now present in Mali. And if Russia chooses to use that presence to further antagonize Europe and European partners in that arena as well.
Perla, I want to give you a chance to weigh in here as well. What are likely to be France's top foreign policy priorities in the MENA region in Macron's second term, and what changes, if any, do you expect to see?
Well, I tend to agree with both Cinzia and Intissar about what they said regarding, the continuity. I really believe there will be a continuity, namely on JCPOA, Iran, if we get soon the parties coming back to the deal. On Lebanon also, even if, the Lebanese feel maybe a little bit disappointed regarding the very important commitment that President Macron has done right after the explosion. But I'm pretty sure this file will remain high on the French and the EU agenda following the elections that will take place, the legislative one on 15th of May. But I would like to introduce also maybe new elements. One of them is the Yemen file. It's not France, it's more at the EU level, I would say, but again, under the French presidency of the Council. But the efforts of the UN Special Envoy, Hans Grunberg, who used to be our EU ambassador for Yemen. I'm touching wood literally here because we really hope that this ceasefire will remain, but it's a good news and full of hope. And I'm sure here the French will continue to have also this priority on their agenda. But allow me also to tell you that regarding the war in Ukraine, it will have really, really impact and evolving changes, mainly on Syria, I would say, again, deterring Russia action here, but then also a moving and a very shifting relation towards the UAE, I would say, who have welcomed President Assad, as you know, very recently. And then I'm just opening questions here. What will be the relation with the UAE after this, but also the relation with Turkey? So I think we are really in a shifting mode, in a moving mode, and very soon we will know what are the priorities. But maybe to come back on real facts, what are the next steps? President Macron will have to form its new government. We don't know yet who will be the next foreign affairs minister. And here it's interesting because due to the fact that many candidates supported him against Marine Le Pen, meaning that he will have to compromise with the other political groups. Mélenchon is one of them. The second thing I wanted to mention here, which is very important, is the legislative election in France that will take place in June, that will also have an impact on the foreign policy, definitely.
Cinzia, given Macron's intense focus on Ukraine, which was itself an issue in the election, how much bandwidth do you think there is in Paris for engaging with the region right now?
Yeah, so that's a very important question because for many European policymakers, Ukraine will absorb now basically all of their bandwidth and many other issues will slide down the list of priorities. However, I do think that with Macron, that is a partial exception because Macron has proven already that he sees the connections between the region, the Middle East and North Africa, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So, for example, he was one of the few Western leaders who tried to engage directly with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia because he understands very well that a key dimension of trying to containing the Russian invasion is to be able to act on energy policies and on two fronts, guarantee the energy security of the European Union without Russian energy. As you know, Macron is also one of those leaders who is pushing to get even tougher and tougher on the embargo on Russian oil and gas. And at the same time, also try to keep some sort of stability in the global energy market. Because the truth is that if the EU institutes a full embargo on Russian energy tomorrow, then the energy prices are going to skyrocket to a level that probably we haven't seen in decades, with severe repercussions on the prices of everything else, and not only in Europe or in Asia, but literally around the world. And so with this sort of in mind, Macron has tried to engage the Saudis already, and then I'm sure he will try to also re-engage again now that he has been re-elected. And by the same token, I think he will follow up with other issues that are linked to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but are absolutely key for the stability of the wider region, such as food security and food prices, which can be a real threat to stability for a number of countries, especially in North Africa.
Perla, I'd like to get your perspective on this as well. You mentioned a number of issues in the region, from Lebanon to Yemen, and Cinzia just touched on some of the kind of knock-on effects of the conflict in Ukraine, like food security. What's the sense in Brussels about the kind of bandwidth to deal with anything other than Ukraine and its knock-on effects right now?
Precisely. And Ukraine is high on the agenda in the European Union. As you know, we have been the continent has been hit by a war. I think that if you go back a little bit, the US has been withdrawing from recently from Iraq, from Syria, from Afghanistan. And there is a kind of vacuum that the EU and before Ukraine feel it's gonna, feel. And this is precisely what Cinzia mentioned, building and ensuring the EU strategic sovereignty or autonomy that was really pushed by President Macron to ensure, a preeminence of the European Union on the international stage. And precisely the example of the security of energy supply is concrete today. It was even in the European circles a discussion before the Russian crisis, because we had the case in 2014, with the invasion of Crimea and Russia cutting off the gas robinet. But even here, even more than before, it is urgent to team up and to become independent from the Russian continent on import on gas, but also with the aim of 2050 to become a carbon-free continent. There is also other initiatives that were pushed under the French presidency and that the European Union are really pushing for is a strategic compass, which is a threat analysis that has been adopted by EU member states on end of March, very recently. And just to give you the whole picture where the EU wants to become really a defense actor today and a strategic actor. And the shock with the Russian invasion of Ukraine has just shown how urgent it is. Final word important on the Gulf region, because the EU is launching, it was already announced by the president of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, to launch a partnership with the Gulf. But I think there is now a momentum, and that was confirmed after the Afghanistan crisis and the fact that the Taliban took over, with the Gulf states helping, so many people to flee from Afghanistan. And this strategy is really coming up very timely. It's going to be adopted on the 3rd of May or beginning of May with a new EU strategy with the Gulf, which is very important because it sets a tone where we want to go in the near future.
Intissar, before we wrap up, I had one question that I wanted to ask you kind of with a longer term outlook. While Le Pen lost again, the far right did better in this election than it's done before, and many of its ideas have been increasingly normalized and become part of the kind of political mainstream in France. You touched on this a little bit earlier, but I wanted to kind of come back to you at the end with a kind of long-term view. What impact do you think that's likely to have on French foreign policy, especially towards North Africa, longer term?
Yeah, I think just to kind of break it down a little bit, in terms of the populations, I think they understand the xenophobic and racist implications of the rise of the far right in France. But in a practical sense, there are some fundamentals that will always be there, right? France will always need to have a working relationship with North African countries, particularly, former colonies. So whomever future elections bring to the Élysée from France's political spectrum, they will need to figure out a way to maintain that. And of course, that will be determined not just by who is in the Élysée, but also, what the legislative branch looks like in France. And this is an important point that Perla brought up. But, the trend with Marine Le Pen and the more inflammatory Eric Zemmour is beyond just policy implications. And I think it extends to the broader problem, that France has in dealing with its minorities, particularly its Muslim citizens. And that really doesn't do much to help France's perception in North Africa, in Africa, and in the Muslim world. And the way that France treats its minorities, when France talks about migrants, they're often talking about French citizens, second and third generation migrants who are discriminated against and stigmatized because of their religion and ethnicity or heritage. If you look at official discourse on radicalization, the way that it is portrayed and the way that it's largely understood is that it's all about some spontaneous rise of an insidious kind of radical Islam in France's midst, brought in by Muslim migrants, particularly here again, Maghrebi migrants, who just stubbornly refuse to assimilate. And this is not really the full picture. France talks about immigrants, but a big portion of that, and what they really mean is, they're talking about French citizens who are seen as the antithesis of what it is to be French and have been marginalized and vilified. They face blatant and vivid discrimination in almost every aspect of their lives. And, for as long as France doesn't really figure out a way to address this issue and continues to talk about assimilation and Muslim separatists and radicalization and migration, etc., there is going to be long-term impact to the way that France is perceived and to the sentiment towards France, which impacts the role that it wants to play in the region. If not with regimes, then definitely with the people of the region. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. But, unfortunately, I don't really see it as a big concern for Macron, so to speak, even Macron, let alone demagogues like Eric Zemmour and Marine Le Pen.
We're running short on time, but before we wrap up, I wanted to give each of you a chance briefly to provide any final thoughts, starting with you, Cinzia.
I think it's a topical moment for Europe, and France, as one of the largest countries in the European Union, has always played a key role in sort of stirring the boat. And amid, very turbulent waters, I think we will see a lot of stirring, and there could be, surprises coming in the direction of further EU integration and sort of more surprising policy choices that were previously perhaps considered too daring. But I think, an empowered Macron who has won a second term and feels invested by other leaders as well will be pushing in that direction.
Perla, maybe you next?
Yes, very brief. The 32% of youth abstention, which for me, in a way, it's a success for Macron to be re-elected. He's the only one without cohabitation, we say in French, government that has managed to be re-elected, which is a success. But at the same time, the score of Marine Le Pen, 41%. And since 20 years, as you exactly said, the far right is getting more and more as an alternative to a blurred right and left traditional electorate, And 42% of youth abstentions means a lot. I mean that the youth, which is the future of a country, has no, projections. So this feared me, honestly.
Intissar, you have the last word.
Yeah, and I think certainly in the long term, there's a lot to think about and kind of ponder in terms of the future of domestic politics in France and the implications for the EU and such. But I think for now, it's really important to kind of, take a moment and just feel a sense of relief that Macron was reelected and the continuity that would imply for France's relationship with the region, with North Africa particularly. I think that's really important in a moment when there is so much turbulence globally, when there is a lot of factors that are going to test North African and Sahel populations and economy. So I think having that level of continuity is really important, at least in the short term. And I think that's worth celebrating and being happy about.
We'll have to leave things there. That's all the time we have for today. But Perla, Cinzia, Intissar, thank you all for joining the program.
Thank you for inviting.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alistair.
Thank you to our listeners for tuning in and to our production team for their work on this week's episode. You can follow MEI on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor, and we will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.